Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI.
This week, we're turning our attention back to the war in Gaza, and in particular, how neighboring Egypt is affected by and responding to the worsening crisis on its northeastern border. How does Cairo perceive the situation in the devastated coastal enclave? What are its most pressing concerns? And how is it trying to address them? What impact will Israel's recently announced humanitarian pauses have on Gaza's severe humanitarian crisis, as well as on the ongoing Israeli military campaign? And what role is Egypt playing in the seemingly stalled talks to negotiate a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, as well as the broader conversation around the day after? To discuss these issues and more, we're joined today by MEI Senior Fellow Mirette Mabrouk. Mirette focuses on economic development, security, and sustainable development issues in Egypt and the surrounding region.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please check out MEI's other podcasts, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Gunul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis. Mirette, welcome to Middle East Focus. It's great to have you back on the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So at the outset, we should note that we are recording on the afternoon of Monday, July 28th. And to start our conversation, let's delve more deeply into the current situation on the ground in the Gaza Strip. So Mirette, could you describe what Gaza's population is experiencing and what are people in the region seeing on their screens every night?
It's actually quite difficult to try and describe what people in Gaza are going through because I don't think we've seen anything like this within people's lifetimes. Now, I'm sure everyone knows, but just for a quick reminder, this latest conflict was triggered when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, killed about 1,200 people, took another 250 hostages. The Israeli response has, to date, killed about 60,000 people, over 145,000 injured. It's important to remember that about 60% of those are women and children. Now, just today, there were at least 36 Palestinians killed across the Gaza Strip. People have been seeing horrific photographs of starving children. The Arab world has been seeing significantly more coverage of this event over the last 2 years than the Western world has. I mean, it's really another discussion as to how different people are covering this. But the Arab world has been seeing significantly more. The images are now ones that you really can't turn away from. I mean, children with their ribs sticking out, 9-month-old children that weigh 6 pounds. And the problem is, as the United Nations has been warning for well over a year and a half, this starvation was entirely preventable. Israel maintains an air, sea, and land blockade, which means you can't exit Gaza without Israeli permission. You can't enter Gaza without Israeli permission. They control their water, they control their gas, they control their trade. So what we're looking at are unbelievable scenes of devastation. More than 92% of all Gaza's residential buildings have been destroyed. You have populations that have been moved backwards and forwards. They have been displaced multiple times, and then they have been forced to move again and again into an ever-shrinking space. The latest displacement orders have moved people from Deir al-Balah, which was one of the areas that had been hit least by Israeli bombing, and have been moved to Al-Mawasi further south. Al-Mawasi is designated a safe space, but has been bombed continuously.
So, Mirette, thank you for that picture of the situation, a ghastly one. But a major news story over the past weekend was the sudden shift in Israeli policy to allow more aid in, as well as to establish daily pauses in fighting around a handful of humanitarian distribution areas. First, could you outline what the Israeli military has actually agreed to permit? And second of all, how much of an impact will those changes have on this widespread levels of hunger, disease, and deprivation in Gaza?
So Thank you so much. It's an excellent question. Now, what Israel has said it will do, and what it has said it will allow, are two things. One are 10-hour daily pauses in the hostilities to allow humanitarian drops, and more importantly, it will allow the UN to start redelivering aid. The UN has been unable to operate since May because Israel turned over all aid distribution to the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, which is a U.S. organization that is backed by the Israelis, that has come under enormous criticism. The UN had originally had over 400 distribution points for aid and was doing, according to everyone, including the Israelis before the war, was doing a good job, and then hasn't been able to. Now, Sunday's deliveries were, according to Tom Fletcher, the UN's aid chief, were a start, but represented, quoting Tom Fletcher, a drop in the ocean, unquote, of what the civilian population needs. Now, the humanitarian pauses implemented by Israel, it is not going to make a difference to the fact that, as we've said, it's not just Gaza's buildings that have been bombed. It is the fact that Gaza's social and economic infrastructure has pretty much been obliterated. There really are no hospitals that are still operating. There, according to human rights organizations, there appear to have been deliberate attempts to kill health and aid workers. The starvation has led to various societal breakdown. So the humanitarian pauses that Israel has said it will allow are going to be a tiny drop in the ocean. Really, the only solution to this is going to be a ceasefire. But you do have to look at the reasons why we are looking at this pause now. And I think it may be that those photographs, those images of starving children have just gotten to one too many people who have, in turn, I think, placed political pressure on their governments. And I want to be very, 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 very clear. This is in no way an encouragement or endorsement of Hamas, all right? But you do have a situation where what you have is what many human rights organizations, including two of Israel's largest human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, have called genocide.
As you pointed out, there has been growing global clamor over the shocking nature of some of these images that we've seen coming out in Gaza. And U.S. President Donald Trump spoke about the crisis there today during his trip to Scotland on July 28th, acknowledging the starvation and pledging to set up food centers there. What was your read on his comments?
So I think the read on the comments is, again, that the international clamor has become very difficult to ignore. Yes, Israel has been bombing and killing civilians for the last 2 years. It has not done so in a vacuum. And the responsibility for that should not rest solely with Israel. It should rest also on those countries that have, if not permitted it, because there's a limit as to how you can react, but have simply made tutting noises and have done nothing else. The United States has provided more help to Israel than any other nation in the world, and is viewed by many as being directly complicit in what is happening in Gaza. And it did not start under President Trump. Blame may be laid in buckets at the feet of the Biden administration, indeed at the feet of former President Biden himself, who were well aware of what was happening. And indeed, you've had several former Biden-era officials who have come out and said they knew precisely what Israel was doing and didn't do anything about it. So there is the perception that the United States is also complicit in this because we have provided both military aid funding and, most importantly, diplomatic cover.
I want to turn now, Mirette, to the view from Cairo on all of this. What's the Egyptian government doing? What's its perspective on things? What's it most worried about here?
The Egyptian government is more worried than I think most people realize. Now, the Arab world and much of the developing world as well, the emerging economies, has been viewing different footage than the Western world has. I'm going to single out the populations of Jordan and Egypt, who share borders with Israel and Palestine and are closer to this than anyone else. I do not discount at all support in the rest of the Arab world, but it is impossible to overstate the amount of support and empathy for the Palestinians that there is in Egypt. And throughout Egypt, there has been rising anger with every one of these new photographs that people see with every dead child. Anger grows in Egypt. And it has complicated life for the Egyptian government in the extreme. And whereas Egypt has many drawbacks, and a lot of them are self-inflicted, this one really isn't. All right, Egypt has a peace treaty with Israel that it has adhered to since it signed it, and it's not about to break a peace treaty, unless it is attacked or something. But to its population, what it looks like is Egypt is complicit in the starvation of these people. Recently, there were attacks on a police station with some young men who went in there, barricaded themselves in, and demanded the opening of the Rafah border so that aid could get in. And that's in Egypt. People don't understand that the Rafah border has not been closed in Egypt. It is closed on the Palestinian side because of the Israelis, something that Israel understands perfectly well. That border is not closed on the Egyptian side. That aid is not stopped in there because the Egyptians are refusing to let it in. So it's also important that there are 5 other crossing points into Israel, but the only one being talked about is the Rafah one, which originally really was meant for people rather than the amount of trucks needed. So this morning saw a speech by Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, where he pointed out that Egypt has attempted to help the Palestinians in every way that it could, and directly implored President Trump as the only person who could bring a halt to this. And I actually, again, don't often find myself agreeing with the President of Egypt, but in this case, I do agree. I think that this issue starts and rests with the United States, because I do think that the only country that is going to be able to impress in any way on Israel is the United States. Well, why won't the Egyptians just take in the poor Palestinians? It's an extraordinary comment. I mean, first of all, Egypt has about 9.5 million refugees. About 8% of Egypt's population is refugees. So it's not a matter of refugees. It's that Egypt, as it has stated since day one, does not want to be complicit in the mass ethnic displacement of Palestinians, which is very, very clearly what Israel is attempting to do. The various members of the Knesset and of the Israeli government have said so over and over and over. Discontent and anger in Egypt is building over this issue, and it is really not something that the Egyptian government is going to be able to tackle because it's not in its hands. So it really is something of a tinderbox situation.
Mirette, if we could turn back to the situation inside of Gaza for just a moment more.
Sure.
In mid-July, Israel announced a new expanded campaign in central Gaza, along with updated displacement orders for civilians. You've alluded to those earlier. Do we have any sense of the aims and objectives of this latest Israeli campaign? And given its recent announcement about these humanitarian pauses, 10-hour pauses daily in several areas around Gaza, How might those affect the course or the duration of this Israeli military operation?
I think that is an excellent question, because I don't think that anyone has any idea what the end game is in this military campaign, and that includes the government of Israel. And I think that the only end game is to keep this going for as long as they can. The stated aim was to destroy Hamas completely. Well, I mean, the leadership of Hamas has been denigrated down to nothing. In fact, so many of Hamas's leadership has been killed that there are questions as to who's actually making decisions during the ceasefire negotiations. Is it the people in Qatar, or is it whoever is still left in Gaza? And I understand that the Qataris actually put their feet down and told the Hamas negotiators in Qatar that if they did not get their act together and, come to the table on negotiations, they would be expelled. And as a result, they have. But what has happened is that the United States and Israel both said, no, we are not doing this. President Trump said, I think Hamas just wants to die. And they said that they were walking away from the ceasefire negotiations. I think it's possible that actually may be a negotiating tactic. I sincerely hope so, but we'll have to wait and see. But to date, there really appears to be no plan other than shuttling people back and forth and watching them die. So there has been enormous rancor in Israel from Israeli citizens who have demanded to know what the end game is and who see no end game in sight, and particularly the families of the hostages, whom we must remember that there are still 50 hostages in Gaza. They think about 20 of them are alive. I cannot imagine what it must be like for their families. And they see no end game in sight. They believe, and I would tend to agree, that they're merely pawns in a game that is being played by Israel's political leadership. As to what the humanitarian pauses will accomplish, I honestly don't know, other than to allow 10 hours to be able to get more aid in, which is, I should note, a massively important thing, even though, just to discuss aid distribution slightly, it's not just that enough aid has not gotten in. It is that since the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation took on, it has acquired a terrible, terrible reputation, basically because the areas that it has been set up in have all been areas that the Israeli military has declared no-go areas. Okay? So to get to it, you risk being shot by Israeli forces, which is precisely what has happened. Over 1,000 people have been killed trying to get food. So the BBC recently ran an interview with a retired US Special Forces officer who had worked for GHF and resigned. And he said that he resigned because, and I quote, I witnessed the Israeli Defense Forces shooting at the crowds of Palestinians, unquote. Now, he said that live shooting was by both the IDF and by his colleagues at GHF. These are American security contractors. And he said that they used live ammunition. They shot at them with tanks. And he said that in his entire career, and again, I quote, he'd never witnessed such a level of brutality and the use of indiscriminate and unnecessary force against a civilian population, an unarmed, starving population, unquote. Now, it's especially relevant because, of course, that this is a U.S. organization and it has U.S. backing, and I think it is starting to resonate. I think earlier today, there were 21 Democratic senators who had sent a letter to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and they expressed grave concerns about the U.S. role and financial support for what they referred to as the troubled GHF, and they urged him to immediately cease all funding for GHF and resume support for the existing UN-led coordination mechanisms. Now, again, it's important to note that GHF had 4 distribution sites. The United Nations has over 400, and it has a system in place. It's also extremely important to note that one of the reasons that the Israeli government had claimed that it didn't want the UN was because it said that Hamas kept stealing the aid. All right. The New York Times recently, I think it was 2 days ago, ran a story saying that despite the fact that Israel had been accusing Hamas of stealing aid provided by the United Nations and other international organizations, the Israeli military has never found proof that Hamas had systematically stolen aid from the United Nations. And again, according to the New York Times, Israeli military officials said that the UN delivery system was largely effective in providing food to Gazans. So it wasn't broken. There was no reason to fix it.
Right, I want to turn now to the issue of the Israel-Hamas talks, because nothing is going to change until we get a deal there.
Yes.
In recent weeks, especially after last month's ceasefire between Israel and Iran, international pressure has grown to bring an end to the fighting between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. What's the current state of play in those negotiations, and what elements are supposed to be central to a deal between the two sides?
At the moment, the Israelis have said that they are moving away from the ceasefire negotiations. But again, that may be a tactic, because it does happen on-off. President Donald Trump has said that, Hamas didn't want to deal, and he said they just want to die. Hamas came out and said, we reject this completely. We absolutely did want to deal. We don't understand what's happening. I wouldn't trust either side to be particularly forthright about any of this, but central to the negotiations for Hamas, and I almost said for the Palestinians, and it is massively, massively, massively important to note that Hamas does not represent the Palestinians. Hamas is the group that took over Gaza in 2007, had elections in 2007, and ensured that there was never another election again. But in any case, Hamas has said that they want Israel to, they don't just want a 60-day ceasefire, they want a permanent end to the war. B, they want the release of various prisoners, and we'll come to that in a moment. C, they want the withdrawal of Gaza back to the pre-October 7th areas that Israel has now moved into and has said that it is going to keep. Israel has said that Hamas must disarm and not be involved in Gaza anymore, and that its hostages must be returned. I would be very surprised if Israel gave up the areas of Gaza that Hamas says that they need to withdraw from. Israel is in what is referred to as the Philadelphia Corridor, and that's in direct contravention of the 1979 agreement, and Egypt has said is it a red line, but in my opinion, Egypt is certainly not going to do anything about it at the moment because there's just too much else going on. Various members of the Israeli government have said flat out that they want all the Palestinians out and they want to settle Gaza, which is in contravention to international law, but honestly, that doesn't seem to be a huge sticking point. At the moment, one of the sticking points referred to, which came up, I think, this morning, was that apparently Hamas has said that they want the release of 30 Palestinian prisoners for every Israeli hostage, whereas before it had been 20 Palestinian prisoners for Israeli hostage. It is further complicated by the fact that it is uncertain who's calling for this, because it appears that the Hamas negotiators in Qatar had one opinion, and Hamas and other groups in Gaza, including Islamic Jihad, are forcing this on the Hamas negotiators in Qatar. So it is seriously, seriously complicated. And I do think that honestly the only way we are going to move forward is if there is external pressure placed on both, and particularly Israel, which holds all the cards at the moment, and that pressure is only going to come from the United States.
Wanted to ask you specifically about the role that Egypt's been playing in the latest round of ceasefire talks.
So Egypt is indispensable in these negotiations. I mean, the limelight goes back and forth. Egypt and Qatar have mostly shared it, but both are indispensable to the negotiations. Now, having said that, politics, as they say, is a dirty business. So you never really know who's going to try and sidle in and, play one negotiator off the other. There have at times, I think, allegedly been some strain between Qatar and Egypt, but honestly, I think it's minor. Qatar's role in this is not really up for question. It is indispensable in these negotiations, I think, because it's been smart enough to not close its doors to people. Because, I mean, if Qatar had kept Hamas out, I mean, it would have made the negotiations significantly more difficult. And the same for Egypt. I mean, Egypt has precisely zero love for armed militant Islamist groups. But in 2013, it refused to declare Hamas a terrorist organization because that would have meant that it couldn't talk to it. And if it couldn't deal with Hamas, then it would have been impossible to have any negotiation with Gaza whatsoever. So I think both countries have shown an enormous amount of patience and foresight. I think we are now at a point where Hamas has a great deal to lose because they do not want to be removed from the picture. My personal view is that if the leaders of Hamas realize that they are going to have to disappear as Hamas and possibly evolve into something else, I mean, God knows it's happened before. Look at, Spain's Basque politicians. Look at Sinn Féin. History has plenty of examples. But as Hamas, I think they need to realize that there is really no room for Hamas. They will not be allowed back in. And I think certainly much of the Arab world is not going to shed any tears over them whatsoever. But there needs to be that flexibility in the negotiations. And I worry about flexibility for both, and particularly with Israel, because you have to remember that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's political survival is directly related to the continuation of this war.
Let's now look a bit beyond this immediate push to halt the fighting. So back in March of 2025 at the Arab League Summit, Cairo had introduced a detailed reconstruction plan for Gaza, which the Trump administration quickly rejected. Briefly, would you remind our audience roughly what the Egyptian side was proposing and why the U.S. had shot it down?
Right. The Egyptian plan is they're now taking care to refer to it as the Arab plan. And essentially what it was a reaction to President Trump's suggestion that the United States take Gaza and turn it into a Riviera. And that would entail the displacement of the entire population of Gaza, which President Trump helpfully suggested be moved into Egypt. Egypt had said from day one that it was not going to take displaced Palestinians. I should point out, by the way, that to date there are about 150,000 Palestinians that have crossed over into Egypt and are there, but refused to do it en masse. Egypt had to come up with a plan, and it did. And that plan essentially was a three-point plan in three stages, and it entailed the reconstruction of Gaza. And the important part about it was that it entailed reconstruction in a way that meant that Palestinians would not need to be dispossessed. The first part was over 6 months, and that entailed sort of refurbishing any buildings that were still standing and were safe for occupation. It also entailed building 300,000 temporary structures to allow people to live, and that would be almost 900,000 people. And then the next stage was over another 9 months, and that would entail building more permanent housing and setting down infrastructure, roads, bridges, water. And then the third plan entailed more reconstruction, more roads, technology, smart cities, a port and an airport. It suggested that the funding would mostly come from Gulf countries and other European countries and investments. And it said that it was willing to host an investment conference to, try and come up with this money. Now, it was an extremely detailed plan, about 112 pages of detailed plan, but its big Achilles heel was the disarmament of Hamas. It did not adequately tackle the disarmament of Hamas. It's merely said that there would have to be a change in the current circumstances, but that all administration in Gaza would have to be through a Palestinian non-affiliated, i.e. not Fatah, not PLO, not Hamas, technocrat government, all right, until, they could hold elections. It was rejected immediately by the Israelis and the United States. And I think it's important to say that the US position has usually mirrored the Israeli position, and it was rejected immediately, partly, I think, because it was not the Riviera that President Trump wanted, and B, the Israelis said it did not adequately address Hamas. My own personal feeling is that the Israelis would have rejected it out of hand anyway, because they have managed to make serious inroads since then. The Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdel-Ati recently reintroduced a newer version of this, which does deal more with disarmament. And they are going to continue to push it because there really is nothing else. Because public opinion has soured to a degree that various Western governments are now making louder tutting noises. I mean, they're still not doing what needs to be done, which is, sanctions, the cessation of military and trade relations for a while. That hasn't happened yet, although it must be noted that the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, has come out and said that France will recognize a Palestinian state. And it is the first major European country to do so. It is a huge deal. So Egypt is pushing this plan. It will continue to push this plan. And I think if the circumstances are right, I do think that they will be able to get funding from the Arab world as long as there are guarantees, and again, those guarantees are going to be American, that the Israelis are not going to blow their investment to smithereens in another couple of years. So it is a plan that is in place, and it is really the only game in town for now.
You've pointed out some of the changing winds in international relations right now, with France declaring its recognition of the Palestinian state. Yes. Of course, today and tomorrow, the 20th and 29th of July, Saudi Arabia and France are co-chairing a conference at the UN in New York to revive the talks on a two-state solution between the Israelis and Palestinians. Is Egypt playing any notable role at this conference? And what are your expectations of what might come out of it?
So, the conference is being driven by France and Saudi Arabia. And I think it's also a recognition of Saudi Arabia's role in the region. You want to remember that Saudi Arabia was the holy grail for the Abraham Accords. But I actually think that it's further away, not just because of what's happening in Gaza, but because I honestly don't think it's just that important to the Saudi Arabians anymore, because Saudi Arabia has really become a huge heavyweight in the region. I think it understands its worth very, very well, and it is going to use it to its advantage. And it does not have to chase the Abraham Accords at all. Now, it has already said it will not normalize without a path to Palestinian statehood. This is diplomatic. Saudi Arabian Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is on record as saying, I think it was last year in an interview with The Atlantic, and I personally don't care about the Palestinian population, but my people do. Now, that comment, I think, is the strongest indicator of the confidence of this man. Generally speaking, you would never have been able to get away with making a statement like that, but he did. He knows what his country can bring to the table, and he will use that weight. So this conference is being driven by France and Saudi Arabia. Egypt will be supportive. Egypt will be happy to play a supporting role in this, but it is really France and Saudi Arabia's baby. It is, I think, also indicative of the fact that the two-state solution, no matter how unbelievable and how distant it looks at the moment, is really the only way out of this. There is no one-state solution. Israel will never allow it. And there is no state solution where the Palestinians are simply carted off somewhere and killed. So this is the only way to go. And the people who pull that off are going to be able to claim an enormous role on the world stage. There is a lot at stake for everyone here.
Well, Mirette, I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today, and for our listeners for tuning in. And finally, a big thanks to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Egypt and the war in Gaza, please visit our website at www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.